am incredibly pleased to see this turnout today. I really thank all of you for coming. I'm going to try to make it worthwhile. I've just come from Israel, and if I told the festival organizers this, they'd probably had heart attacks because my plane came in this morning. I had a unique chance to go there because the Mount Carmel caves, this is a view of the Wadi Maharat at Mount Carmel, and this is Taboon Cave, which preserves the deepest stratigraphy of human evolution from 400,000 years ago up until about 50,000 years ago, including a complete Neanderthal skeleton. School Cave, which is over here, has a series of burials of some of the earliest anatomically modern humans anywhere outside of Africa. This is about 100,000 to 120,000 years old. El Wad Cave, which is here, is deepest in its Natufian evidence. The Natufians are the people who lived immediately before the domestication of plants and animals. So these are sedentary hunter-gatherers who are developing the social systems that are necessary to become agriculturalists. And these caves are now a World Heritage Site. They just had a UNESCO event to recognize their designation, and I got invited to it. So I was really pleased to be able to do that. This is an exciting place because this is the place where modern humans, as we understand them, and Neanderthals, as we understand them, were encountering each other. When I ask the question, are we the last Neanderthals, understand that this question has two sides, right? Which is the other side being, are Neanderthals the first humans? And are we really different from them? As I'm going to tell you, almost all of us have around about 3% of our ancestry. So out of all of your ancestors who lived 100,000 years ago, 97% of them or around that were Africans. 3% of them or around that were Neanderthals. However, I mean, that's not a huge contribution, right? You'd say 3%. That's 3%. 3% in your genealogy is more or less like one of your great-great-great-grandparents. So if you know your genealogy and you go back that 5 generations, think one of them could be a Neanderthal. That's not really what it means, but if you imagine going back from yourself to your parents, to your grandparents, to your great-grandparents, tracing those lines backwards in time so far back that you've gone back 100,000 years, that's a long time, and in fact, it's a lot of branches. There are just trillions and trillions of ways that your genealogy is woven through there. Around about 3% of your ancestors at that time were Neanderthals. If you think about it this way, this is true of almost everybody in the world. It's less true in sub-Saharan Africa, where they have much less. We don't know if it's 0, but it's much less. Think about it in terms of numbers. Today, there are 6 billion people living in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. 3% of their ancestry traces to Neanderthals. We're talking around about 200 million Neanderthals. Neanderthals today are more successful than they ever were when they actually existed. And that's meaningful. They're part of our heritage. And I'm very sympathetic to these people. And I'll show you that in the history of anthropology, we have not always been sympathetic. The last Neanderthals that we know about lived here, Gibraltar. And the Rock of Gibraltar, of course, is a famous image. Here's Gibraltar from a further distance. And around the base of it, on the back side, are sea caves. Here they are. These sea caves today are right at sea level, and some of them are actually, the base of the caves are submerged. During the late Pleistocene, the sea level was much lower, and in fact there was a plain that extended out around 3 kilometers in front of these caves. These caves were the closest shelter for the Neanderthals who were living here around about 30,000 years ago. And this cave in particular, Gorham's Cave, preserves the most recent evidence of Neanderthals known anywhere. If you say, where were the last Neanderthals? As far as we know, the last Neanderthals were at the very tip of Western Europe. There really was something that happened. There's a reason why the Neanderthal population doesn't exist anymore. Modern humans spread. The genes that make up most of today's heritage were spreading with them. And Neanderthals were increasingly marginalized at the edges, the very edges of the world. Here's the excavation going on at Gorham's. My friend Clive Finlayson was with me in Israel last week, so I'm really pleased that I get to show his Gibraltar pictures. This is a great place to visit, by the way. Gibraltar is really, really nice. It's also a great place to shelter your money. Okay, I wouldn't know anything about that. Anthropologists are not, we have no need of financial shelters. If we did, we'd probably pick the Cayman Islands. Okay, so these are all the places that I've outlined here on the map are places where we have complete mitochondrial DNA sequences from Neanderthals. These are not all the Neanderthals. In fact, we have hundreds of Neanderthal sites. We have hundreds of Neanderthal skeletal specimens. I'll show you a few of those bones. Most of the bones that we find are bits and pieces. A tooth here, part of a jaw there, part of a tibia in another place. You're going to see the record is fragmentary, and I'll show you very directly. But nowadays, with genetics, we're adding another dimension to our knowledge of these people, because we can study the genealogy of these people through their genetic relationships. I just want to emphasize, as I start, Neanderthals are the people that lived between around 200,000 years ago and around 30,000 years ago. If I was giving this lecture 15 years ago, as I used to do, I would have said they're mainly European. We know that there are some in West Asia. Today, new evidence has cast a very different image of what their geographic range was. They extend all the way across Central Asia right to the Altai Mountains. We have Neanderthals here, known today from their DNA, and they extend across a very vast geographic range. We now know from these mitochondrial DNA sequences that the greatest diversity of the Neanderthals is in the east. That this was principally a Central Asian population that once in a while was entering Europe. Europe is like the backwater, and West Asia, Central Asia are Neanderthal central. That's hugely significant to us because it reflects what we understand about their adaptations. These are people that are breaking stereotypes that we've had of them for a long time. This Neanderthal is not the first to have been discovered, nor was it the first to have been named, but it is from Gibraltar. This is the Forbes Quarry specimen, and it was found in 1848. When people found it, they didn't initially recognize that this was an ancient kind of person. I mean, here it is, it's a skull. And, okay, well, it's sort of funny looking, but, there were weird people who used to live here, so maybe it's one of theirs. I like to start Neanderthals with this Gibraltar skull because this is the Neanderthal that was touched by Darwin. Darwin did not know much about the evidence of human evolution because there wasn't much. They had found just a couple of Neanderthals by the time Darwin was writing on the origin of species. They had not yet found any earlier hominins. Darwin made some projections about what they would find. Wallace, who was contemporary of Darwin, co-inventor of natural selection, made predictions about what they would find. Ernst Haeckel, who was the German popularizer of Darwin, made predictions about what they would find, but they hadn't found anything yet except for a couple of Neanderthals. Darwin had this Gibraltar Neanderthal brought to him at Down House. He examined it. I like to think of the Neanderthal coming there, and in Darwin's study, where you're not supposed to take photographs, you've got the glass. If you've seen this movie Creation, where they have the buff Darwin, and his wife Jennifer Connelly, you see him using this glass and examining specimens, and I think that's sort of, you can just imagine him having this Neanderthal there, and that's the evidence that there was of our evolution at the time that he was writing. We've come a long way since then. This is one of the first phylogenies, a tree of relationships representing human evolution. And this phylogeny has Homo sapiens at the top. This is drawn by Ernst Haeckel, who was a German contemporary of Darwin. Homo sapiens at the top. We've got all kinds of other primates down here. And I give you the one that you actually can't read from there to save the punchline, because this is one that has a place for Neanderthals. They're right here, and immediate antecedents to humans. They're called Homo stupidus. Stupidus meaning that they couldn't talk. They were mute. And if there's one thing that we recognize as being human, it is the fact that we talk to each other. This is something that's fundamentally human. It's something that's not shared with any other creatures. They have their own forms of communication, but none of them are verbal. None of them are linguistic communication. We have learned a lot about the Neanderthals and communication in the last several years. This skeleton from Kabara Cave, also in Mount Carmel, I was outside Kabara last week also, has a hyoid bone. This is a bone in the throat. I'll show you a couple here. These are hyoids from an earlier site, from Atapuerca in Spain. These hyoid bones are the only bone in your body that reflects the shape of your vocal tract. And they don't reflect it all that well, but these are different from the one that we have earlier in human evolution. The evidence, as far as we know it, from the vocal auditory tract, including some genetics of the inner ear and the morphology of the throat, suggests that their vocal auditory tract in Neanderthals had adapted in a human-like way. That's not real satisfying, right? That's like saying, well, okay, the voice is there potentially. The ears are there. In humans, the voice and the ears have co-adapted with language. So it's very probable that Neanderthals have some form of language. Archaeology tends to back this up. Here are pigment crayons. Now, you look at them and you say, these are hunks of rock. They're hunks of rock of a mineral called manganese dioxide, which is black pigment. It's still used industrially as a black pigment. They, as you can see, have these striations on them. Microscopically, these striations have the anatomy of striations that are used on a soft material as opposed to a hard material. These aren't sidewalk chalks. They're pigments that have been used on hides or skin, something soft. We have pigments from a lot of Neanderthal sites. Here's a shell from southern Spain, and this is a shell, it's a scallop shell, and as you can see on one side, this is the opposite side. Same thing, front and back. On one side, it has this natural band of pigment. This is the way the scallop is made. On the other side, Neanderthals have taken red ochre and put in the corresponding band of pigment. Here's a bunch of shells that they collected. All of them have holes in them. They didn't drill these holes. These holes are drilled by a marine snail. Snails are awful creatures sometimes. Some of them are predators of these clams. And yet Neanderthals gathered the ones with the holes and carried them up to their place. They didn't gather the ones without the holes. They were stringing them on something. Neanderthals late in their existence are making these complicated bone tools. They're beginning to play with projectile weaponry. And from several sites now, we have evidence of the distal wing bones of birds, raptors, vultures, eagles, the distal wing bones with systematic cut marks on them. These are not cut marks to take the meat off. As you know from birds, there's no meat on the distal parts. These are cut marks that correspond with feather removal. So our Neanderthals are decorating themselves with feathers. Well, this is what a really great Neanderthal assemblage looks like. This is my favorite Neanderthal assemblage of bones. This is from Krapina, which is in Croatia. It is the single largest accumulation of Neanderthal bones anywhere in the world. This is my friend Jakov Radovčić, who until recently was the curator of the collection. This is our normal form. This is what I'm used to dealing with as an anthropologist. It's not beautiful skeletons, but it's beautiful to me because you can see that there are many copies of each part. They're broken copies, but you can start to study their variability. It is only recently that we've been able to do this with genetics. And I'll show you this little part of a bone. It's from Vindija Cave. It's also in Croatia. This is the first bone to have produced substantial genome evidence from a Neanderthal. This bone was not recognized as being a hominid when it was first discovered. It was tossed in a box with the faunal bones, the animal bones. This is what today is generating most of our knowledge about Neanderthal peoples. These little pieces of bone that didn't mean anything anatomically. This is a piece of a shin bone. It's a piece of a tibia. This is the place, Vindhya Cave. Vindhya is, to me, just like the driftless area of Wisconsin. I mean, it's really this sort of beautiful place outside of it. And it's at the edge of the glaciers. It's a temperate place throughout all of the late Pleistocene. 3 Vindhya bones, all of them anatomically basically worthless, all of them have produced a complete genome. I want to very quickly show you that mechanically, this is the sort of thing that we can do now with genes. I'm going to show you what the limits of it are, how little we actually understand when we're looking at a gene, and what it will take to learn more. So let me just give you a quick example. I'm going to use as an example a paper that came out a couple of years ago. This is about glucose transporters. Glucose transporters are proteins that enable your cells to take up sugar. And it happens that there are many different glucose transporters in the human genome. Many of them are active in different kinds of tissues. And I'm going to look in particular at one. Here we are. This is SLC2A1. Genes have names like this. You don't have to know what they are. In fact, the computers have to know what they are. For us, it suffices to know that this is a sugar transporter. It's taking sugar out of the bloodstream and getting it into cells. And these bars represent where it's active. So here in muscle tissue, this is not very active. In liver tissue, it's not very active. In brain tissue, it's active. So this is a sugar transporter for the brain. And it's much more active in humans than it is in chimpanzees or in rhesus monkeys. So, sugar transport brain, active in humans, much less so than other primates. That's what we know about this gene. Now, you could immediately hypothesize why we would want to have more sugar uptake in our brain than other primates do. It's because we have these giant brains. It seems like this could be essential to fueling the brain. And that doesn't tell you a lot, but it does give you some of the mechanics of what's necessary in order to have big brains. You have to transport sugar. We know something about the evolution of this gene. When we compare humans to chimpanzees, a key question is, why do we express more of this than they do? How does it come to be that we're making more of this in our brain than they are? And the answer is that in one part of this gene, the untranslated region 5', so that's upstream of it, in one part of this gene, humans have a bunch of changes relative to the common ancestor of humans and chimps. Chimps don't have any. For the other parts of the gene, there's no big story. So what's going on is that this gene is expressed in humans, it's upregulated more, because it has sequence changes that are upregulating it. All right, that's mechanical. It's just saying, how does the gene work? Nowadays, anybody, high school students, my undergraduates, anybody can look at the human gene sequence and determine what's going on with it. And anybody can look at Neanderthal genetic data and see what's going on with that. The genome browser is totally free to everybody. Your tax dollars have paid for it. When you said the human genome, we've got to sequence it, they had to develop the tools to look at it. Here's the tools to look at it. Here's the human sequence of this part of that gene, the part that's regulating the activity of the gene. Here you see humans are different from other primates. The other primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, rhesus monkeys, marmosets, tarsiers, we have genome projects for all of these. And here they are, and where they're like us, there's a dot, and where they're different, there's a letter. Here's a case where we're different from every other primate that we looked at. And here are Neanderthal sequences, and if they were different from us, you would see a letter here. And in fact, you do see some letters. These letters represent, in all likelihood, damage to the DNA that's been encased in the ground for all this time. You can't just take a Neanderthal sequence and trust it. It's broken all over the place because it's been fragmented underground for tens of thousands of years. But if you know what you're looking at, you can use it as a genotype. You can say, here, what are the odds that it would be broken at just this place to look just like us? Well, the odds of that are low. So we think probably they share with us these two changes that upregulate this gene that make it active more in the big human brain. Well, let me take it back to Mount Carmel, because I mentioned that this is the area of the world where Neanderthals and modern humans were encountering each other as modern humans left Africa. And that makes it very important for anthropologists and archaeologists. This is a mud cave, which is just north of the Sea of Galilee, and I was there on Thursday. So we've got, a mud means column, and there's this huge column right out in front of the cave. It's got two openings. A mud has produced this skull, and it comes with a skeleton. This is a Neanderthal-like skull. It's got this brow ridge in front of it. It's a long skull. It's barrel-shaped. Its maximum width is about halfway up. It's not higher. Here's a modern human skull from School, which is that cave in Mount Carmel that I showed you, and it's a higher skull. It still has a brow ridge, but its face is tucked in underneath of that frontal lobe of its brain a little bit. It's got a higher forehead. It's a shorter skull. It's more rounded. That's what separates modern humans from Neanderthals morphologically. But this Neanderthal doesn't have many of the characteristics of European Neanderthals. It doesn't have a projection in the back of its skull, this occipital bun that other Neanderthals have. It doesn't have a tiny mastoid process. That, you feel it here behind your ear. It has a great big one, like much more big than this School individual. It doesn't have a skeleton that's 5'6" and bandy-legged. It has a tall skeleton. It's about 6 feet tall. It's the least Neanderthal-like of the Neanderthals, and here it is in the population where modern humans and Neanderthals were encountering each other. We have potentially the evidence of this interaction, and we're now learning what its importance is genetically. At last, we're able to put together multiple sources of evidence about these ancient people and interpret how human they were and how Neanderthal we are. We're not identical to them. We're not the last Neanderthals in that sense. It's not like there's a parallel world and the Neanderthals are still on it, living human-like existences, and they transport across and see that, oh, they're just like us, except a little bit different. That's famously the plot of a science fiction novel. It's not like that. But inside of Africa and outside of Africa 50,000, 100,000 years ago, there were parallel cultural worlds. And these people were doing similar kinds of things, and they began to encounter each other. And now that we can look at that and start thinking about what it is that makes these people different, we're very likely to discover it's not what we anticipated. Maybe it's disease. Maybe it's efficiency. Maybe it's the way the muscles worked. Maybe it's something that's invisible to us in the archaeological record, but important to them. The exciting thing is that I think we're going to figure out what it is. And when we figure it out, we'll know a lot about the pathway by which we became human. Okay, so I'm gonna finish it off there, and yeah, I don't want to go any further. But I do want to mention, for those of you who are interested in this topic, we're doing a massive open online course in Wisconsin. You guys have heard of these MOOCs. And our massive open online course is called Human Evolution, Past and Future. It is totally free for anybody to sign up. It begins in January. You can find it on Coursera, the website. You can find it by searching for Human Evolution, Past and Future. I'm mentioning it now because part of why I've been traveling around to Israel, Africa, other places, is to film the components of this course. So we're going to archaeological sites and presenting them firsthand and doing interviews with the people who are doing the work there. So if you're interested in this topic and want to follow it up and see where this is going, you can get a much broader point of view by doing that. And all the videos will be available online on YouTube, in the course. And I hope that a lot of you will sign up. We've got 23,000 people now from everywhere in the world. The topic is human evolution, past and future. On Coursera, yeah. I said 23,000 people now, there's 20% of them are US. After that, it's Brazil, India, the UK, and Spain. It is really... Coursera is course with an R-A after it. Coursera, yep. All right. All right, so thank you, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions.
Could you compare the level of culture when you showed the site and all its division with Homo sapiens sapien culture at a comparable time?
Yeah, what we're seeing in these sites is that the spatial distribution of things in Neanderthals is fundamentally like what we're seeing in the Middle Stone Age of Africa. Where we have sites, not every site preserves that kind of structure, but where they do, it's the same. The transport of raw materials is fundamentally similar, although in some parts of Africa,